Thank you everyone for joining us this morning for breakfast. Isn't it nice to do something sort of face to face just in this end to the year, and what a big year it's been, hey? So look, for us here at Royal Far West, over the last 5 years, we've helped more country kids get back on track in more communities through more channels than ever before. This year we supported 5,196 children with deep intensive supports, and that's up 32% from last year, and 12,706 beneficiaries, which include educators and parents and carers. We've explored, we've innovated, and we've invested heavily in the growth of our programs, our brand and fundraising. Our focus this year has really been to consolidate and ensure that we have a high quality and sustainable business model that can deliver on our 2025 strategic plan and beyond. As a result, we undertook an essential transformation of the Royal Far West operating model to align our structure, accountabilities, delegations and ways of working to our new strategic priorities and our organisational values. The needs of our children and our families are at the heart of this consolidation and transformation. We must be responsive to the growing levels of complexity we are seeing in children and the unprecedented level of uncertainty and challenge faced by country families, whilst finding it harder to access the services they desperately need. Organisational change is hard, and difficult decisions have been made this year, none more so than the decisions to conclude our oral health services and our Healthy Kids at Bus Stop as standalone programs. We are now in the integration phase of this transformation that will allow us to leverage our deep clinical expertise, our multidisciplinary approach to support our most vulnerable country children by focusing on 3 main areas: child and family services, school and preschool services, and our new community recovery services. Within weeks of the devastating floods in northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland, I received a phone call from the Federal Department of Health requesting Royal Far West form part of a response to the crisis. Key decision makers had listened to our call for children's needs to be placed in the centre of community-led recovery efforts. When responding to the 2019 bushfires, we initially did so with no government funding. The funding we now have received will continue our community recovery work in 50 communities across New South Wales and Queensland, and is a testament to the hard work of our teams on the ground and the significant impact they are having as they support children, their families and their teachers to not only recover from the trauma of these overwhelming and incessant events, but build their resilience in the face of an uncertain future. With my first full year as CEO complete, it has been a good time to reflect on our new values: care, connected, passionate and impact. Being entrusted with the stewardship of this extraordinary organisation is a privilege beyond measure, and together with my deeply talented and committed staff team, our steadfast partners, all of you, our donors and my wise and incredibly hard-working board members, we strive to live up to these values in our service to country children. We have a great morning in store for you with our panel as we focus in on children's mental health. We're going to talk about the need, how Royal Far West is addressing this need, and what's working and why. Here are a few stats to ponder as we get into our discussion. Half of all lifetime mental health problems emerge in childhood. 1 in 5 children in regional and remote Australia have a mental disorder. Limited access and long waiting lists, long distances to travel to services exacerbate these problems. Parents and carers of over half the children in Royal Far West Paediatric Development Program identify as having mental health issues. We have had an increase in 36% in psychology and psychiatry services since 2017. Kids and families have never been more complex. To unpick these issues a bit further, I'd like to introduce our panel. And we do have an apology, sadly, from our Chief Psychiatrist, Josephine Anderson, who unfortunately has COVID, but is being replaced by the wonderful Emma, who's been a psychologist at Royal Far West for quite some time. So, on to our panel. So Emma, I know these well, but sometimes you discover quite interesting things in their bios. Emma Newsome-Smith is this psychology clinical lead at Royal Far West. She is a registered psychologist with endorsement in clinical psychology and is a board-approved supervisor. Emma has over 20 years of experience working with children and families, presenting with a range of developmental, learning, behavioural and emotional difficulties. Emma is passionate about making meaningful connections with clients and helping parents understand and support their children from a strengths-based perspective. Since joining Royal Far West in 2000, Emma has held the positions of clinical psychologist, senior clinical psychologist, psychology team leader, and now psychology clinical lead. In that time, she's worked across all programs and in all service delivery models, including face-to-face, telehealth and outreach. Emma was also the senior psychologist on the Department of Education pilot program, which pioneered an outreach telehealth model to meet school counsellor gaps in rural and remote communities. And I remember when I first joined Royal Far West 6 years ago, I followed a family and Emma was the psychologist supporting that child, and it was a great introduction to how deeply we work with families and connect with them. So thank you, Emma. Our second panel member is Sarah Eaglin, who is the Head of Community Recovery Services, the service I mentioned in my opening. Sarah has been at Royal Far West for, is it 11 years? It's 10 now. 10 years, I've added a year on, it probably feels that way at times, with 25 years of experience working in the areas of adult and child mental health. Sarah has enjoyed the challenge of designing and leading the delivery of a new multidisciplinary service model to help children and their families recover from the devastating impact of the 2019-2020 bushfires and now the 2022 floods. Sarah, along with her extensive professional experience, also has a Master's in Social Work and postgraduate qualifications in Clinical Supervision and Practice Education. And the program that Sarah really has developed, and it's fair to say is probably her baby, has also been recognised and was the winner of the 2021 community, I think it was the 2021, it's the years of community award for disaster resilience, and that was a great honour, and we don't do it for those acknowledgements, but it's really good to see the hard work of the team being recognised in that way. And finally, our third panellist is Dagny Hopp. Dagny is the Occupational Therapy and Allied Health Clinical Lead at Royal Far West. She's passionate about about helping people understand behaviour, why we do what we do to help carers and teachers relate to their kids' challenges and see their amazing strengths. After graduating from university in 2006, Dagny worked as a paediatric occupational therapist in private practice for 10 years, with a specialty focus on development, regulation, sensory processing and relationships/connection. She joined Royal Far West in 2015 as an occupational therapy team leader before becoming clinical manager and now the occupational therapy and allied health clinical lead. Dagny has also spent 12 years running a private practice in Griffith, New South Wales, where she spends weekends once a month responding to the persistent and growing need for specialist paediatric allied health in the region. So it's a pretty, so welcome our panellists. It's a pretty great lineup that we've got. So into the questions. So I just want to myth bust this myth right up front. So Emma, do young children have mental health issues?
The short answer is yes, they do. So we know that young children can show signs of mental health problems very early on in life. So things like lasting worries, sadness, trouble sleeping, eating and engaging at school. We know that in children under 12, approximately 8% can be diagnosed with ADHD, and approximately 7% can be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. We also know that neurodiverse children, so children who are on the spectrum, so have autism spectrum disorder, can also experience significant difficulties with behaviour and emotion as a result of that diagnosis. And those things can include things like aggressive and oppositional behaviour. There's quite a bit of research surrounding that that's been done by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. We also know, setting the diagnosis aside, we also know that it's very important to consider the context in which the child is living. So the impact of developmental trauma can certainly mimic signs of a mental health diagnosis very early on. So children who are exposed to emotional abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, they may have experienced a series of adverse life events or indeed natural disasters, which is happening more and more, can also show similar behaviours to a mental health disorder. So it's important to, when we're looking at a child, particularly a young child, to take all of that into consideration, and bearing in mind that exposure to trauma can actually increase the prevalence of mental health issues as well.
And we're certainly seeing an increase in trauma factors in children as well here at Royal Far West.
Yep.
So, this question was asked of me quite recently, and it's a complex one. And the question is mental health for children getting worse, or is diagnosis getting better and leading to higher incidence?
So, offence to answer, but I think it's correct, is it's actually both. So we know, certainly in my time working, which is quite a lengthy period of time, I've noticed increasing complexity of presentation and difficulties in children. I've also noticed just in the general population and community there's an increasing awareness of mental health difficulties. There's a decreasing stigma around mental health difficulties, and that's led to an increase in help-seeking behaviours. So when people identify that there might be something going on for themselves or their child and they seek help, naturally then we will expect to see an increase in diagnoses and then obviously an increase in incident rates. COVID is another factor, and there's increasing evidence that's coming out suggesting that COVID obviously has not been a great time for many, many people, and that has led to an increase in mental health difficulties in children. And also floods, bushfires for our rural communities has also increased incidence of mental health.
Great, thank you, Emma. So we of course focus on supporting children living in rural and remote areas, and what are the factors, Dagny, that are driving the increase in mental health that are specific to rural and remote communities?
Well, I think before we answer that question, we need to first consider some of the factors that Emma just mentioned that are increasing the numbers of mental health difficulties, I guess, across the globe. And something we need to understand about all of that is the commonality of connection. There's this difficulty with connection that we see in all of these factors. And that's relevant because connection is a biological imperative. In order to be safe, physically safe in your world, and also in order to feel safe, we need to have strong connections with the people in our world. And all of those factors that Emma mentioned are rupturing a lot of the connections. So COVID, for example, yes, we spent a lot of time with our families, and in some ways there were some positives there, but it also made things much, much harder. So, increased stress in the house, having to do homeschooling and working from home and all of those things at the same time absolutely increased the stresses within the house. And it also took away a lot of the protective factors. People say it takes a village. Village was gone. So people were really struggling not only with these excess stresses and emotions within their homes and difficulty with their important relationships, but also without the supports that they needed to be able to I guess, continue to thrive. Now, if we look at the relevance for our rural and remote communities, we know that there is more disadvantage in rural and remote communities, and wherever there's more disadvantage, if you're already a little bit worse off, if there are all of these other factors, you're going to be much more sensitive to it. So there are a number of things that mean that it is harder to cope with those things in rural and remote communities. And the other piece of this puzzle is services. You know, there's always been a lack of services, or at least a shortage of services in rural and remote communities. That's why for the last 12 years I've been going out to Griffith once a month on a weekend. It's not because I hate having free weekends to myself, it's because there's a massive need there. And you know that there are some services that sort of come and go, but there's a lot of turnover, and I can see it firsthand every time an OT leaves Griffith or in the surrounding communities. My wait list just explodes, and there are lots of kids, you know, with complex needs who need support now, but you know they're really having to wait. So that combination of excess stress and lack of supports, whether it's your immediate supports or the services around you, really, I guess makes those communities more vulnerable.
I think as well, what we hear a lot of as well for clinicians that are working in rural and remote areas, they're again dealing with this complexity, but they don't have the supports around them like our team do here at Royal Far West, and so there is a lot of professional isolation, which is further driving people away from working in rural and remote areas. So Emma, how has COVID, Dagny's touched on this, but how's COVID and other disaster events exposed the inequity between city and country children and families in terms of health outcomes and services?
Yeah, so as Dagny mentioned, obviously country areas are often quite disadvantaged in terms of workforce. There's often high turnover rates, there's often a lot of vacancies. I know particularly in psychology, having a psychologist in a rural area is a unicorn in fact, often doesn't happen. So that's certainly increased the inequity there, the COVID factor. It's interesting, the fault line study, which looked into Australia's response to COVID-19, revealed probably nothing that was particularly surprising, but really reinforced that families from low socioeconomic backgrounds, women, children and others who are already experiencing quite a bit of disadvantage bore the brunt of the pandemic. And First Nation people obviously were also particularly vulnerable. And when we think about that in the context of the families and the country people that we work with, that describes a large proportion of the people that we work with. So yeah, that's part of it. The other part is access to local services, as we have touched on. Rural areas often have significant waiting lists, and when we went through lockdown and wait lists were closed for non-essential health, those wait lists have blown out, and it's just made it increasingly difficult for families and children from rural areas to access support when they need it. A further study that was done by the Murdoch Institute has shown that if parents and caregivers have sustained psychosocial stresses, which if you think of a pandemic and then we throw in a flood or a bushfire on top of that, there are worse outcomes for their children, just as the nature of the fact that the parents aren't coping as well. So that's another factor that's really increased that inequity.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, you really just take heed when you're listening to radio or news about the GP crisis in this country. That is far worse in country areas, and often it is the GP that unlocks services for families, and so many families just aren't in a position to act on the troubles that their children have. Now, these children aren't necessarily yet presenting to hospitals, but if there isn't action, if there isn't support for these kids, then these are the kind of things that we're seeing in the teenage years, and certainly exacerbated during COVID. And interestingly, there was a study done around the impact of COVID and hospital presentations for children and young people. And regional hospitals, we didn't have any data on regional kids because regional hospitals actually didn't have the staff to complete the survey. And yet what we saw in metro areas were significant increases in eating disorders and suicidality and suicide attempts. So, you know, I think we always have to, and that's our role, to really champion rural and remote communities and what they're missing out on, and the fact that we must address this inequity. So We talk about often, and it's a very inaccessible term, developmental vulnerability. Generally, when I start talking about that, people's eyes glaze over. So what does this actually mean, Emma and Dagny?
I'll start. So developmental vulnerability, as we interpret it, is a term that's used by the Australian Early Development Census. And it's basically a way of collecting data on a child when they commence school and how they're tracking across various domains. The domains are their physical health and well-being, how they are socially, so how they engage with others, their emotional maturity and their ability to manage their emotions, their language and cognitive skills. So essentially that's how they learn when they get to school, how they pick up new skills, and also their communication skills and knowledge. And so for a child to be considered developmentally vulnerable, as we coin it, it's basically if they're functioning below the 10th percentile in those domains. So many children obviously will have difficulty across multiple domains, some may have difficulty just in one domain. But we know that children who are developmentally vulnerable have significant difficulties with things like transitioning to school, forming relationships with others, coping with just general life frustrations, and obviously picking up learning new skills.
And I mean, you can imagine all of those difficulties then are kind of precursors to then having mental health challenges later in life, and not just later in life as in adulthood, but in childhood as well. So I think we need to really recognise that having a typically developing body and living in a safe, predictable environment with safe, attuned, connected caregivers and relationships is a real luxury. And having all of those things in place really means you are really, really well set up to have a healthy and thriving and full life. And it's a luxury because, first of all, there are many kids who are born with nervous systems that don't support that typical development, and of course we also look at the other pieces, which is the environment and the relationships as well. And having challenges in one or more of those areas means that life is harder, and when life is harder, it really has an impact on that ability to form and maintain those connections that we need to maintain good mental health, as we age. It's harder for the person with those developmental vulnerabilities because, if I can't hold my pencil and write like all of the other kids can, it makes me feel bad. If I can't cope with frustration just as well as other people, it comes out in these big behaviours. And then people don't understand me and they think that I'm naughty and bad and I need to be, have consequences and things like that. And the more we are misunderstanding these kids through these behaviours that they are demonstrating, the more we tend to sort of isolate them, and the more they feel like they have to keep themselves safe and they have to do this on their own. So if we can flip that and if we can start to explain, hey, this behaviour is actually a communication of this need, and if you change how you respond in the moment, actually you're going to get a better outcome in the moment. The behaviour decreases and improves. Mom, dad, teacher are a little bit calmer because they can understand why the kids are doing those things. We end up having a better outcome for everybody.
Thanks, Dagny. So how is all these additional challenges, more than ever before, impacting the work that we do at Royal Far West? Are we seeing greater need?
Yes, short answer. Obviously I've been here for 22 years, so I can probably speak to this a little. So obviously when I started working here, the psychology team was the smallest team, and we had one psychiatrist who came in one day a week. And our most common referrals at that time when I started work here were children with learning disorder or difficulties, generally occurring in the context of otherwise essentially normal development and a fairly stable family background. Those types of referrals now are very few and far between. We're seeing a significant increase in the complexity, as you mentioned, Jackie, early on, in the families that are coming in. So both in terms of the complexity of the child who comes in for assessment or therapy, and in terms of the number of developmental domains that they might be experiencing difficulties and the severity of the impact that those difficulties are having. And we're also seeing increasing complexity in the family and the system around the child. Another way to look at this question, I guess, would be to look at the huge growth we've had in the clinical staff at Royal Far West across all disciplines. And many of those staff are trained in mental health care delivery, and yet we still can't keep up with demand. So we know that all of our staff are busy seeing many children with complex diagnoses, which have been exacerbated as well by COVID. So we've had, I guess, the double whammy of having the increasing complexity in the midst of a pandemic, and in the context of other extreme weather events as well. So I guess we're trying to be as innovative and responsive as we can at Royal Far West. As Jackie mentioned, we've got the flood recovery program coming up. We are piloting at the moment a comprehensive psychiatric assessment clinic. So we're trying new things to meet demand. Jackie, do you want to speak a little about the discipline as well?
Yeah. Thanks. So I think for a long time mental health support, I guess, was looked at in terms of psychology and psychiatry primarily, maybe some social work and some counselling. But really what we understand about mental health is it's not separate from physical development and physical health. It is all one and the same. All of these things exist within this boundary of this body, and within societies and communities. And so we know that, you know, coming in with these mental health specific disciplines, when things go really poorly and when there's a crisis, yes, it can help, but geez, we've got to go upstream. We've got to go early intervention and look at those other factors that are having an impact. And if we think that developmental vulnerability then has a potential to lead to worse outcomes for mental health, well then we've got to go, actually, if a child is having difficulty with their language, let's support their language, and that makes life that little bit easier for them to connect, and then more likely to have a better outcome. From the OT side as well, when I started here at Royal Far West, occupational therapy was working on fine motor skills and kind of dabbling in a little bit of sensory processing, both of which are really important. But we are now kind of the brains trust, I guess, of the regulation space, and so we know it's not just sensory regulation, it's emotion regulation and connection. And so a huge part of what we do is helping to calm kids' nervous systems down. So not only do we teach them how to recognize when they're getting upset or angry or frustrated, but also to be able to go, oh, okay, these are the things I can do to help my body feel safe again. But that's one piece of it. One of the other things that we do is we teach the adults around the kids how to notice when things are starting to escalate, how they need to adjust their response so that, as we said, you know, you get a better outcome. And not only are we doing that in OT, you know, all of the disciplines are really good at this. You know, the speech pathologists know that they can't work on the TH sound if a child is bouncing off the walls. So that's why you'll be seeing our speechies using the OT footballs and things to help regulate the kids, so that they can then work on, you know, those higher order things. So we've seen a real change in how we work in response to this change in the cohort. And I guess we also have more information too.
So families are getting complex. We've heard that kids are getting more complex, family situations, the stresses on families are huge. But are children responding differently to adults, Sarah?
Yeah, yes, they are. And I think, talking from the perspective of disaster recovery, it's important to understand that the impact of the disaster is different for children because, as you said, their brain's developing. So how they experience a stressful event, whether it's a disaster or a family separation or bereavement, is really different. Their brain sees it differently, and they have different tools to recover from that. And research has also shown, particularly with disaster recovery, that the things that are most important to adults are very different to children. So for parents, their priority is saving life of themselves and their children. And for children, their priority is sticking close to their parent caregiver. And so you have that conflict where the parents want to keep the children safe and away from danger, and for the child that can be incredibly frightening. So that's another thing that we need to take into account, to see it from their perspective, that they actually see it very differently. And then another thing that happens, I guess, particularly for disaster recovery, is that home becomes a lot less safe. So we know, unfortunately from research, that physical, sexual violence at home increases dramatically after disasters. So again, that's another thing that children experience quite differently. And for a long time, we just haven't understood the impact on children. We've liked to believe that they're resilient, they're bounced back. If something tricky happens, they perhaps might not even notice, or they'll quickly forget, and they'll soon be back to playing. And so we haven't paid enough attention to that, and we haven't seen it. And even, you know, at the beginning of the bushfires, there really wasn't a service dedicated for children's recovery. We've got a bit better the last couple of years. So we are recognising the impact. And when you're asking how children react differently, they do, and also they don't. I was thinking, as an adult, if something's upset me, I might be more likely to have a row with my husband about how he stacked the dishwasher before I realise actually what I'm feeling is actually a bit scared and worried about something, and we need to talk about that. And similarly for children, they're not going to come to you and say, I'm really worried about this, you know, I've got concerns about that, I'm feeling sad. What you're going to see is really quite different. It's going to be in their behaviour, it's going to be in their relationships, in their learning. And so you have to be a bit of a detective to think, first of all, trying to put put yourself in their shoes about what might be most important to them, but also be a detective about how is their behaviour showing you what's going on. And the other thing to be really mindful of is it's really different for each child. It will depend, as Dagny says, on what's going on for them, what stage of development they are.
Yes, this is really interesting, isn't it? But you sort of touched on this, Sarah. What are some of those early warning signs that you should be looking, all of us as parents or with young people in our lives, what are perhaps some of those early warning signs we should be alert to?
Well, it's really interesting because I'll talk from the perspective of the bushfire recovery and flood recovery work. So often, the schools would invite us to come and work with the children, but they might say by the time we were there that actually I think they're okay. You know, it's a few months since the disaster now. They're not. We think they're fine, but you know, come in and support. And so we would come, and then as soon as we met the children and gave them the space to talk about their experience, they very much needed to talk about it. And what they told us, and often it'd be the first time they'd spoken about it at all with anyone, so they'd been struggling on their own and not being able to sleep, having intrusive thoughts, worried that they were going mad, that something was wrong with them because they hadn't been able to share that with anyone. They'd been more irritable, they couldn't focus. They were saying, you know, I just can't do my work like I used to. Their relationships were suffering. They were having more arguments with their friends. They were having more arguments at home. Physical signs, tummy aches, headaches. And again, they didn't realise that was because of the difficulties they're experiencing. They were, again, just really worried. But what was fantastic was we worked with children in groups with the fabulous Stormbirds and Season for Growth programme that Louise and Fiona have shared with us. And the opportunity for them to talk with other children and the relief when they heard, oh my gosh, you're having those intrusive thoughts too, you're having those scary nightmares. And then also learning what the children were doing. So actually getting tips and tools from themselves. You know, we help the children to look at ways to help them with their feelings and process their experience. But they learned the most from each other, which was beautiful to see. So I guess, yeah, again, it's just being really alert and open and curious about what the children are experiencing, and not assuming that because they're not coming to say, I'm worried, that they aren't worried. They certainly are.
And how is it important, or how important is it to actually pick up on these cues early?
It's really important because the longer you leave things without help, the more serious and hard they become for the children. And children will naturally blame themselves. So that's the kind of first thought would be, well, it's my fault. They think there's something wrong with them. And there's also a greater danger that they might use unhelpful coping strategies. And what we're sadly seeing, particularly with primary school children, is an increase in self-harm behaviours. so cutting, suicide ideation, just because they have nowhere else to go and there's nothing else to replace that.
So this sounds all pretty dire, and it's a lot of hard information to take in. But it's not all dire. Things are working. There are things you can do. So what interventions, Sarah, are you having success with around children's mental health?
Okay, well, what we actually did with the bushfire recovery program and now the flood recovery, we actually took what we do well in every program at Royal Far West. So I'd worked here for, as Jackie said, 10 years, so I was really familiar with the assessment and the therapy. So we took how we work with children individually, how we work with them in groups, how we support teachers, and how we work with parents, because obviously to support children, you need to work with everyone around them. And what we don't need is to provide a mini version of adult therapy. And that's traditionally what has been offered actually after disasters and the many bushfires that Australia's experienced over a very many number of years, is that what would be offered would be counselling to children and to adults. And then, not surprisingly, there was no take-up. And then those services would withdraw going, okay, I think there's no need here. So it's been really important to look at things differently. And one of the first things I did when trying to design the model was look at, well, what's the research in this area? And as I mentioned, children have been invisible. So there was very little research to guide what would help them. So fortunately, we had that kind of wealth of knowledge at Royal Far West to know what works with other kinds of trauma and stressful events for children. So we based it on that. And one thing that was really helpful was there were 5 essential elements identified. And the story behind that was in 2007, Professor Hobfull, who was an expert in disasters and community recovery, brought together 25 experts around the world to look at what do children need. They knew that they knew that debriefing doesn't work. They knew that they could kind of wait and see which children are going to present with really more severe symptoms and then offer specialised therapy. But they wanted to do something before you got to that more serious state. So they came up with 5 simple elements to support children, and this has been really important guiding principles. So they're safety, calm, self and collective efficacy, connectedness, as Dagny said, and hope. So for children, this means that we help the child feel safe and calm, to feel they've got some control over what's happening to them, help them feel connected, and also give them a reason to hope and to hope that things will be a bit different in the future. And in terms of the actual program, so we've been working in New South Wales up to now. We're going into Queensland from next year too. So we're a multidisciplinary team. So that means we have speech pathologists, OTs, psychologists, social workers. And we support children under 12, working with them directly, but also all the adults in their life. So their teachers, their parents, but also community services, people that are working with them locally. And one of the most important things has been the groups that Louise and Fiona have shared with us. Louise, I remember, trained the team in the early days of COVID. We were able to have a brief window where we could have some in-person training, and Louise came to this room and taught the team the Stormbirds program. And then from those groups, we can often then see which children might need more intensive support. And it may be that it is speech therapy. So it's the children with pre-existing vulnerability that have the most difficulty recovering from disasters. So they're not equal opportunity events. So your pre-disaster circumstance and situation will really define how you're going to recover. So that's why it may be more important to focus on a child's speech and language to then enable them to be able to continue their recovery journey from the disaster. And we're lucky that we've been able to have independent evaluation of the programme. We won the Disaster Resilience Award, and that's been great because we've been able to contribute to knowledge in this area as well.
Mm. So how do you, I mean, we see families every day that tell us we're very fortunate, you know, that you've changed our lives, you've changed our child's life, you've saved our family, you've saved our marriage, things like that, almost every day. So we're quite fortunate, but we need more than that. We need to measure our impact. So really a question for all of you, how do we measure our impact, and how do we know what we're doing is actually working beyond that anecdote?
Well, in terms of our programme, we were really fortunate to have that independent evaluation by Charles Sturt University. And at its simplest, it's really asking people, how was that? You know, what was good, what could be improved? And also it's using clinical tools, so you can do pre and post measures, such as a strength and difficulties questionnaire that psychologists use, so they can measure how children are before and after. But we're not in the lab, and it's a real world, and there's things happening all the time. And I must admit, I really am a bit of a nightmare for Charles Sturt University, because they'll say, so you're delivering this program differently in every community. It's like, yeah, because every community is asking for it differently. So, okay, so they've been really creative in how they measure that impact, taking into account that we are delivering response to need. And I think one thing we've really tried to do as well is to include children. So often they're ignored. So we've asked them what their experience of therapy's been, what's their experience of the groups has been, and then using that information to amplify their voice.
Thanks. I mean, it's fairly similar across our organisation and across our programs. We have various different outcome measures that we use to track any kind of progress that the kids make. We always set goals at the beginning of intervention, and where we can, just like with Sarah, we try to involve the kids in the goal setting. In OT, actually, we have a really nice kids goal setting tool that's very visual for our telecare, where it comes up on the screen and the kids can pick, oh, these are the areas that I really want to work on, and I feel this happy or sad or whatever about how I am able to do it, and then we re-look at it at the end of the intervention. But yeah, I think the combination of those outcome measures and then surveys, I think we get so much really great information from surveys to see how, you know, the impact that we've made either for an individual child or a family or a school. So there are a number of different ways.
And finally, I think as well, another really important thing that kind of learn almost as a byproduct, and you know, the panel have talked about working with those around the children, and we know we consistently, through those surveys, find that teachers really have improved confidence around how they can support kids with these developmental challenges and big behaviours, etc. So it was quite exciting. We were all very excited here at Royal Far West when the National Children's Mental Health Strategy was released. Emma, what did you like about it, and was there anything missing?
Yes, I was very excited to see this too. It's the first time we've had, I guess, a national strategy that looks at the mental health and wellbeing of children under 12 in a really comprehensive and evidence-informed way. I particularly liked the framework that sort of underpinned the entire strategy, and the principles that were the foundation of that framework really spoke to, I think, the way that we work at Royal Far West, including being very child-centred, strengths-based, as well as arguing for equal access to appropriate and culturally appropriate services for children, their families and their communities. The way that the mental health strategy thinks about mental health and wellbeing is on a continuum, which is something that I really like. So rather than just focusing on a child having a diagnosis and that dictating how they might function, the child is thought of as being on a continuum. So they may have a diagnosis, but they may be functioning quite well at a particular time. So that's a really nice way, I think, of looking at how a child is going. I also particularly like, and it really speaks, I think, to the way that we work at Royal Far West, given that we're working remotely from the children and families that we serve, is that it's all about empowering the systems around the child in a really holistic way. So a lot of the strategy talks to providing parents with support through parenting programs, making sure the schools are advocating and supporting a child in a particular way, all of these to bolster a child's wellbeing. In terms of what's missing, I think it's pretty comprehensive, but I guess the only thing that I think maybe could have been fleshed out a little bit more was having some more targeted outcomes. So we've got this great strategy. Again, how are we going to assess whether it's actually working? So some more targeted outcomes would have been good.
Terrific, thank you. So resilience, Dagny, we all talk about resilience. It's a bit of a buzzword at the moment. Why is building resilience in children and families important?
It is a buzzword, and I think that it's probably first important to actually really understand what resilience is. So resilience is not having bad things happen to you and then them not having any effect and you just continue living your life and being really strong. Resilience is really about being able to experience hardship recognize the impact that it has on you, give yourself allow yourself to access any kind of support strategies or coping mechanisms that you already know that help you, and then support and connection from the people around you as well, whether it might be your family or friends or even, psychological services. And then with all of that, being able to move on having healed from whatever has happened. So often we go, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and just be more resilient. And that's not how it works. We actually have to be active participants in being able to move on from hardship. And the other thing that I think is important to know is you don't sort of leave your resilience on the shelf waiting for some massive, life-altering event to happen, and then you go, okay, I'm divorced, now I need to go and use this resilience. You need it all day, every day. You might have a horror morning where, your 2-year-old rubs their yogurt on your black shirt, and then you forget your phone at home, and then put mascara on your face. All of those things could happen and go really, really poorly. And you could completely lose it and yell at your sweet little 2-year-old, or lose it at your boss. Or if you're resilient, you'd be able to go, okay, all of this bad stuff is happening. Let's just exhale. You'd be able to do things to help yourself to recover and then, move on with your day. I think something that's really dangerous is this idea that, you've just got to sort of soldier on. And if you keep doing that without getting any supports, something ultimately could potentially sort of push you over the edge. So it's so important for people to understand what it is, and then actually be able to harness it not only in their families and kids, but also within the rest of their lives.
So I just have a question. Is that the purpose of the scarf this morning?
No, but I definitely thought that it could potentially happen when at 7:10 my son said, I want you to make my porridge.
So, Dagny, what supports do families have, and how do they build resilience in their children?
Families have a lot of strength. We've been talking about all of this disadvantage and challenge, and all of those things are very real. But, one of the massive strengths in families is there is always love, right? The families who come here who have real difficulties with their connection, relationships and engagement, it's not because they don't love their kids. We all love our kids, so there's that real strength in that love and that drive to want to help. I think that, again, the increase of awareness of mental health issues and developmental issues means that people are starting to be able to access the right services for themselves at the right times. I think we're so fortunate because we get to come to work and work in a place that really gives us a lot of meaning. We can see that there's this huge need, and we're actually able to meet it, not completely, but more and more we're able to meet that need. And so being able to access services that really wrap around the child and the family and the community, I think that's huge, and it helps to support that resilience because it starts to break down what that actually means. It starts to help people to go, oh, actually, behaviour is a communication of a need. And emotion is something that is okay to have, and this is how you can cope with it. There's so much, not only in what we do, but also within communities that really helps to support resilience within families.
Thanks, Dagny. And just so we can finish on a high note, this is my favourite part of the day, is actually hearing a couple of success stories. So would each of you like to share your favourite family or client story?
Sure, I'll start. I've got the mic. Mine is actually, it's not for a specific family or a client, it's actually a relationship that we have with a school. So we do some work in a remote Aboriginal community, and we've been working with one of the schools there. It's an independent Aboriginal school for about 4 years. And first of all, one of the things I'm really proud about that relationship is with a lot of changes in leadership, we've still been able to maintain the relationship. And the teaching staff, we've worked a lot with the teaching staff. We've done a lot of capacity building with them, teaching them about regulation and trauma and behaviour. And most of the staff have actually stayed on, and often there's quite a lot of turnover. I'm not going to pretend that it's because of us, but geez, I just wonder if there's maybe a little bit of a connection, because if you understand the kids, if you understand the massive behaviour challenges and the real complexity that happens within these communities, and you can adjust your response, it actually makes it easier to stay in that environment, and you get much more out of it. You know, you don't become a teacher for the big bucks, you do it for the reward. And a lot of these teachers were kind of losing that reward. But my favourite thing, before I'll shut up in a sec, my favourite story out of that school is one of the teachers said to us that the kids had noticed that the teachers were different. One of the kids said, "Oh, sir, you and the teachers are not angry anymore. You're not shouting at us anymore." And it was just so nice to hear that, because they just shifted that response. They saw this change in the kids. You know, it's not a magic wand, but, you know, to know that the kids have noticed and are starting to feel safer there, that gives me the warm fuzzies.
Terrific, thank you.
Yeah, I'll share a story from one of the little children, the families we're working with in Bateman's Bay. So the family sadly lost their house in the fire, and we first met the elder daughter when we did the Stormbirds group, when we first went to the school in 2020. And she really benefited from the group, and she didn't need any extra support. That had been really, really helpful for her. But then on our next visit to the school, they were getting more worried about her younger brother, who'd initially gone a bit under the radar. He was quite withdrawn. He'd really lost interest in the things he used to enjoy. He just felt he seemed to be very sad. So he joined our second Stormbirds group. And it was the first chance really that he'd been able to share how he'd been feeling, and he was experiencing a lot of the things that I spoke about, the disturbed sleep, intrusive memories. He'd been really traumatised by the experience of the loss of the fire and all the instability they'd had since, with frequent moves, and really struggled to get accommodation and things like that. So we did the group, and then we found that actually he would really benefit for some occupational therapy to help with, particularly primarily his regulation. He was really in that kind of fight-or-flight mode all the time. So, and after having the connection and relationship with the OT, and that the therapy made a wondrous difference. The teachers were commenting on it, parents were commenting on it. He was then able to then move on to psychology therapy. So he was kind of in the right space for that. And that's what's been lovely, is having the team that can stay with the child for what they need. And the psychology therapy, again, made a great difference. And at the same time, while we're doing that, we're able to work with the teachers, help with classroom strategies and supports, and then also offer the parents support from our social workers and our parent group tuning into kids. So I like this example because it sort of incorporates most of the elements of the programme. And then 2 weeks ago, the OT, Billy and I went down to the school, and Billy did her session with the little boy in person, which he loved. And he's a really shy little boy, unless you know him well. But he comes alive with Billy. And then that evening, one of the purposes of us being down there was we went to the school concert, school extravaganza, and I have sat through a few with my own children, which has been quite long and tedious, but this one I was absolutely gripped. It was amazing. They'd involved the whole school, all the, sometimes the boys are a bit more reluctant, they had them up there. It was incredible. And the principal started the show by saying, this isn't about who the children are or what they should be, it's what they can dream to be. So we were all kind of close to tears from the beginning, and then it was awesome. And we saw the little boy up on stage, this shy boy who'd been so withdrawn and sad, and he was wearing a spangly silver jacket, and he was dancing his heart out, and you could see those 5 elements that I spoke of that are so important, that connectedness, that hope. He'd learnt new skills practicing. So, and the principal afterwards was saying, that is what recovery looks like. That is healing. He says, bring back the joy, bring back the love. The parents were in the audience all connecting, and it was just beautiful, yeah.
I had trouble narrowing this down, I guess. But one that's a client story that has stuck with me was one that I've worked with, I guess, in the last 3 years. A boy in year 6, he was 11, from Central West, from this tiny, tiny little school, only had 2 teachers, 2 classrooms, and it was possibly one of the most disadvantaged schools I've worked with in terms of the level of trauma that most of the families who had children at the school had experienced. And this boy was no different. He unfortunately had been diagnosed with ADHD already when I met with him. He'd had a very disrupted family background. He'd been bounced between various households. There'd been a history of substance abuse in his family. His parents had split up. He was living with an aunt when I met with him. He wasn't well liked, unfortunately, as a child. He was hard for people to gel with because of his behaviour. He was quite difficult and challenging in the school environment. Unfortunately, when I saw him, he was not attending school very often. So when I had my session via telehealth, and I also had some outreach trips, the outreach trips he tended to be there at school, and that was great because I got to meet him one-on-one, face-to-face. We got to play some basketball and establish a connection and a relationship. He often wouldn't attend school though until he started to come in every Tuesday when I had my telehealth session with him, so that was lovely. We got to know each other very well, and it was really about the connection. When I talk about doing psychological therapy or CBT, there really wasn't a heavy element of that with this boy. It was really just about getting to know him, giving him a safe space to talk about what had been going on in his life, which was horrendous, I have to say. But then also giving him a sense of hope. And what I started to see as I started to work with him over quite a lengthy period of time, I had the luxury of working with him for 2 years, which is pretty unheard of. He really started to open up trust, and I saw his behaviour change. So at school, he started to engage more with his learning. He was very bright, but he was defiant and wouldn't engage. But then we started to see him picking things up at school. He would actually sit down and he'd get a sense of mastery when he could do a task. I saw him starting to form friendships with his peers who previously had possibly been a little bit scared of him because of his outbursts. And the teachers actually reflected to me, so similar to what you described, Sarah, that they'd seen a change in him. So his whole demeanour changed. He became much more, I don't like the word pleasant, but I guess that was essentially what happened. And I worked with him up until the end of year 6, and then unfortunately that's when I had to depart because he went to high school. But I did hear through the network that he'd made a very successful transition to high school, which I think was very important and pretty good.
Oh, wow, great story. Thank you. Look, I think they're great stories, and it goes to really part of the transformation that I mentioned in the opening, that Royal Far West is not a transactional service. Kids with this level of complexity, disadvantage, never having access to services, really need people that are there for the long haul and will work really deeply with them and all of the people around them. And this is why we now work in all of our clinicians are working in multidisciplinary teams so they can provide that broad support. And so for us, even though 5,000 children may not sound like a lot of kids, we work so deeply with those kids and change their lives, as we've heard. So enough from us. I hope you've kind of learnt a little bit more about how Royal Far West thinks about mental health and children's mental health. I'd love to hand over to you guys now, and if you have any questions about any of the work that we're doing, the programs, or just generally kids' mental health more broadly, or want to share anything from your own experience. I know we've got some great people in the room. Any questions? No? Yes?
You touched on face-to-face interaction. You go on your outreach and then you go back and deliver services on telecare. Can you talk me through the importance of building that relationship face-to-face and how that translates?
Yep. So particularly for the schools that I was working with on that program, they were small communities, very small communities, quite disadvantaged and a lot of trauma. So for us to sort of blow in as city experts and try and work with kids, it wasn't going to wash. So part of our first kind of trips out were really just about becoming part of the fabric of that school and community. So it was a very softly approach. Just going in, we might go and play basketball with the kids. One of the favourite things they'd like to do is show me the veggie garden in the school. So we just walk around and do that sort of thing. And with the teaching staff, again, it was a very relationship-based. So part of my visit might be just going and sitting, and I'd take biscuits in and we just have a bit of a chat and a yarn, and get to know the teaching staff and I guess the families. So that's a big part of how that then we translate that to success for telehealth. So not having that would have made that much more difficult, and I think particularly with particularly the boy that I talked about, I think that would not have worked at all. He just would have shut off from me completely. So very important part of the work. Yep.
Any other questions?
Just more of a comment. Thank you for the shout out on Stormbirds and Seasons for Growth. I think it's really nice to hear, because we know Stormbirds can be that screening process for children, and just that example is really nice. I think about how a child that was able to get a lot from being in that setting, but then you can identify things later. And I think it's really nice also to hear, you know, psychology, social work, OT, all these things, they're all really based on that connection, and it's those day-to-day, minute-to-minute things that we do with children. So I think the power of that relationship, so it just sounds beautiful, all the work, and it's nice to hear kind of what happens after that with some of the programmes that we're involved with probably at the start.
Just got one comment. You make a lot of emphasis on mental health. When I was a kid, I was always talking about healthy body and healthy mind. Do you place much emphasis on physical health in your treatment?
Yep, so particularly for our assessment and diagnosis, which is our PDP program, we have paediatricians. So obviously a big part of the assessment is a physical and a medical assessment. So we do things like check the children's eyes. We might say, okay, maybe there's a hearing difficulty. If there are other concerns, we will then refer the child to further assessment, say for genetic clinic or endocrine clinic, that sort of thing. So yes, the physical is a big part of it. And obviously it's a big part of, if we're looking at a diagnosis, we need to get that right as well. So if a child can't hear, for example, perhaps that's why they're not paying attention rather than they've got ADHD. So it's definitely a big part of it. Do you want to say anything?
A big part of what we do in occupational therapy is looking at the physical development of the kids, so their gross motor skills and fine motor skills and things like that, and it has a huge impact on their ability to have success in the classroom. You know, if you've got a real floppy little noodle of a body and you don't have nice core stability, then it makes it really difficult to focus. It makes it difficult to hold your pencil. So from that perspective, we definitely look at that as well. It's a huge foundational piece for all higher level skill development. The other side of it, though, is that that felt safety. So there are certain things that we need in order for our bodies and our nervous systems to feel safe, and one of them is movement. So, you know, you can see when a kid has been sitting down for too long, they will not sit down anymore. They will rock on the chair and get up and walk around. I'm sure a lot of you do this, right? This is my thing that I have to do if I have to sit still for a long time. And in order to be here and be successful and use my brain, I had to make sure I got up and went to the gym this morning, because those things help to make me feel good. And that's a huge piece of not only how we work with kids in direct therapy, but also one of the things that we talk to the adults about as well. You know, kids need to move.
And dietetics is also an important part of our paediatric development program as well, and you know, we have a lot of fussy eaters, kind of comes with the territory, doesn't it? So we support them in that way as well. Margot.
Hi. I just want to congratulate you on everything that you've done through a really difficult few years, and your whole trauma-informed approach to the child, the family, the school, the community is very much how my organisation works as well. I think that trauma-informed, what I'm curious about, I guess, is what's next and what the vision is around how you continue to work. Again, acknowledging the depth of work is so incredibly important to create change, but also the length of time you need to be in a community to actually create and walk alongside, and you beautifully said that, Emma, around you're really walking alongside the community. So I'm curious about what's the vision moving forward to enable you to be able to stay in communities for that length of time that creates that change in that trauma-informed way.
Well, I might kick off and then please jump in. I And one of the reasons why we did consolidate into 3 programs, so we did a lot of things at Royal Far West over the last 5 years, and we trialled different things, and that was kind of right for us. Now we've worked out what we're really good at, what our strengths are that others don't have. Like, there are a lot of other organisations that can deliver more transactional style services, or services that are really suitable for kind of mild to moderate types of challenges, but we really have that core strength in that complex area, and so we've decided to really lean into that. And so part of now really focusing on 3 areas is ensuring that we can continue to build the expertise in those areas, really build the strength in our multidisciplinary teams. And in terms of communities, it's a great question, and this is one of the challenges that we have with government at times, is understanding that there really needs to be sustainable funding for programs in communities, particularly post-recovery. And I remember that the researchers that did the research after the Black Saturday fires was like, we haven't learned from this. You've got to be there for 3 to 5 years at least. And so part of that is around education, and so we'll continue to advocate in that way. But I'm also pleased to say that in the bushfire recovery program, there are some schools that have said to us, actually, I think we've got this now. There's a lot of capacity within the school, there's a lot of capacity within the community. So it's also not a matter of having to be there forever. And I think that's also a really important part of the model, that we are really building capacity in local services, co-facilitating with local health professionals. We don't want to be there forever. Ultimately we want to do ourselves out of a job. But I think that in the meantime, it's really important that we continue to keep advocating, have the data around our impact so that we can demonstrate the change that we're making and the impact that we're having. You guys, anything?
I'll just say one thing about one of the partnerships that we have in Fitzroy Crossing in WA. So we have, I guess since 2015, we have developed a relationship with Mana Wantagura Women's Resource Centre in Fitzroy Crossing. And one of the really nice things about that is we've been able to maintain those relationships and really build those relationships, and also, as Sarah said, kind of become a part of the community. So when we go back, we see people go, oh wow, you guys are back in town. And so we're really being able to show them that, yes, we are from far away. Yes, COVID has been what it has been, but we're coming back and we're coming back and we're coming back. So even just our presence there means that the community is trusting us more and more. It has been really difficult. Funding has been, the biggest barrier. We now have the most clinical resource dedicated to that program. We've got 3 days of an OT, 3 days of a speechie, and 3 days of a social worker, and it's unfunded. This is out of Royal Far West pocket. So that is, there are parts of the partnership, parts of the activities that we do out there that have been funded by different corporates, which is fantastic. It would just be really nice to be able to get something that was a bit more sustainable, so we could, have depth as well as breadth.
Absolutely, and I think the other really important part is our clever use of technology, and so that's a really core component. And in fact, during COVID, our partners in Fitzroy said that we were the only continual service through COVID into a remote Aboriginal community, because of the work we'd done establishing the links using technology and really bridging that divide. And so even despite COVID, that little school that Dagny talked about, every week those kids were getting speech therapy and occupational therapy every single week, and teachers were getting capacity building. And it is important. And for our the CEO Emily Carter of Mana Wantagura, actually saying this is closing the gap for us, and we're understanding about trauma and the impact that it's had on us and our community. And so these are the kind of strengths, I suppose, that we want to continue to lean into and try and support more and more kids, and that's what it's all about for us. Any final questions? Yes.
It relates, there's so much alignment, I think, with so many people here in terms of the work that we do supporting children and young people. I think one of the things that comes up, and Sarah touched on it, is listening to children and young people and what their needs are and responding to what their needs are, not assuming as adults that we know what they need. And I think that landscape is changing, so I think there is more research and more evidence, but it needs to take a big shift into the future. I noted, Sarah, you were talking about the evaluation with Charles Sturt University, and one of the things that we talk about frequently is researching and gaining evidence with children and young people, but not on them. And it's a really fine balance, and there's a real ethical issue for us around that. And I wonder how, you mentioned the strengths and difficulties questionnaire, and that's quite a challenging piece of information to gather. We've looked at it and thought, that just takes it to a whole new level. So how is it that you strike that balance in terms of gathering that information, but not researching on it?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and it is such a balance. And that's why it's been really good having this long relationship with Charles Sturt University. So when we're in the second phase of the evaluation now, we wanted to have a greater voice for children through it. So with their expertise, they came up with a couple of measures that could suit children. And what was wonderful is that they gave them to us, and then we had a go. And we came back and said, first measure, great, children are fine with that. Well, most of them, and then if not, we will choose who should complete it, who it's not going to be a positive thing for. But the second one, we're like, no, it's too long. They didn't understand the question, so that was really good. It has to be kind of an active two-way process, and that connection between the people with the expertise in research and the people on the ground actually doing the evaluation with the children. So I think, and we're continuing to evolve that. But one really great bit of research that I'm part of the steering group for the Healthy North Coast PHN, and they've just researched with 6,000 children the impact of the floods, and that's producing incredible information, particularly about the impact on primary school children, whose anxiety levels are far higher than the older children or the adults, and they're staying higher for longer. But they're also, the next step is actually involving the children in co-design. So they've found out how they're impacted. Next thing is, what do you need in recovery? So that's going to be so interesting to see what the children come up. So involving them right at every stage. So yeah, it's definitely getting a bit better, but yeah, hard to balance.
Jackie, the struggles of community, I suppose, starting that relationship and getting in there, and you mentioned it before, Emma, about coming in cold as city folk into some of these small things. That might be something that at Kids Fix we might be able to help, I suppose, bridge that gap, coming with the rally cars, coming with the troopers. You guys saw that down on the waterfront when we did the handover. That can, I suppose, moving forward, we can change our rally route for the year to go into those areas where it's needed. We're trying to put together with Moxie Dairies in Forbes and Eugowra at the moment for a weekend early in March. I think it's 10, 11, 12. 26 of their staff at the dairy lost their houses at Eugowra. We're doing that through one of their local guys at their workplace health and safety at the dairy to try to coordinate that. That might be something that we can work together, particularly with there. And then also our route for next year, next September, is actually through the Snowy Mountains from Narooma out to Riverina in that part. I'm just opening it up because it might be a way of opening those pathways for you guys to get into those schools, those communities with a bunch of fun cars, some community stuff like that to break down that barrier. They've then got a linkage back to, hey, these guys actually are fun because they turned up with
Exactly. Oh, what do you mean we're fun? No, look, it's no, I
can be very
yeah,
come into a community
absolutely.
offering all these things and
I think one of the things that is always a bit more difficult sometimes is engaging parents, and often we find that a bit of a struggle, particularly if we're delivering most of the services in the school. So things like that are really important. And I think, you know, you raise a great point. And one thing I'm really, really excited about is that I'm seeing, you know, this desire, this willingness, like a real genuine willingness to collaborate to support kids right across the sector. And that's really exciting because no one organisation is going to be able to deal with these challenges. So, you know, we're collaborating, you know, we're trying to keep up with all the collaborations we're involved in, but they're so important. And so, you know, I think that's a great opportunity for us to think about.
We've never been so connected.
Yes.
With these stupid things, but we've never been more disconnected at the same
Totally.
time. So rural communities, coming from Dubbo, growing up out in those areas as well, is a lot of these services turn up when there's been a natural disaster or whatever it is, and it's all of a sudden it's well and truly overwhelmed. There's the same thing happened in Ugara, a lot of stuff. What do we do? They got overwhelmed with everybody else's crap, not, you know, really doing that sort of stuff. I think you guys do a fabulous job in engaging with that community and finding those right people to do that, and then going, right, where do you need to help? We don't need everybody else's old mattresses and crap like that. We actually need, you know, people, we need finances, you know, that sort of stuff like that. We need gear. And one of the projects we're going to work with them closely is who have you got in that community of special needs kids that need their, you know, special equipment to communicate. How do we open up that sort of stuff for those kids like that? It might be that we go to Trek and Giant and say, give all the kids a new push bike, because they lost all those in the floods. So how do we start that? They sort of turn up with a bit of fun, everyone gets a new treadly. Now there are all these people like you guys there to do that sort of support like that and help from there, break down that barrier, because country people can be pretty proud, as you no doubt know.
Absolutely.
And don't want to be seen to be the poor cousins out in the
I mean, absolutely. Even despite working in country in New South Wales for almost 100 years, you know, I've seen it for myself. Sometimes it still can be like, what are you guys doing here? And, you know, wonderfully, the team are just so fantastic at really being, a lot of people say community-led, but just listening and, you know, being really flexible and taking the time and building trust. And I suppose that's another, I don't want to keep, you know, harping away at government, but it is really important that government understand that we have to build trust, and this takes time, and this is actually part of the clinical process. And so, you know, that's where we have great outcomes and great success, when we actually take that time to build those relationships, both in person and via telehealth. Any other final questions? Before we close, I just want to say a massive thank you. All of you that are in this room have supported us in one way or another. It really has been a challenging couple of years with COVID, the impact on fundraising, on events and things like that, even getting out into community. And, you know, you've stood by us at every turn, and it has made the difference in us actually being able to continue to deliver and actually deliver more. And, you know, we're going to continue to work in that way. And again, from all of us, just a massive thank you for your support, and we couldn't do it without you. Thanks, everyone.